Well, let's speak more on this now. And joining me for this conversation is Brand Africa founder and chairperson Thebe Ikalafeng, and via the virtual platform, we're joined by commentator Malaika Mahlatsi, who joins us all the way from Germany this evening. To both of you, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you in studio, Mr. Ikalafeng, albeit...
It was this, or it was the 100 meters sprint, so... So we talk about Miss South Africa.
Indeed, of all these subjects. Well, let's kick this off, because one thing is for sure, this would not have set well with Chidimma, because wherever she sits today, she's possibly going through a whole lot, trying to process exactly what it is, or who is she, and does she really belong to this country? How do we rationalize what she has gone through over the past few days? And perhaps a question might come as to, would she be justified if she actually decides, you know what, this is all too much, I don't need this, let me drop off this Miss South Africa pageant?
Well, she's a young woman. She's 23 years old, I think, or so. And she would have probably grown up all this time believing that she is South African because she's got a South African identity, South African passport. She was born in South Africa. So this would have been a bit confusing to her, I imagine. It would be a bit upsetting as well because we're now questioning her identity. We're questioning who she is. And as far as she's concerned, and I think what gave her the confidence to enter Miss South Africa is her own belief and understanding that she is South African and that she qualifies on those basis.
Malaika, let's come to you. To your mind, is Malaika a South African, or are questions around her nationality? It is rather Chidimma. I'm sorry about that. Is she South African? And who are we to judge who she is if she says she is South African?
Thank you very much, Toli. And I just want to just agree with Thebe about the kind of anxiety. I think it's very important that we touch on that, because a lot of the times when politicians make the kinds of statements that they make, when they take very populist statements, this is not just about a political statement you are making. These are ordinary people's lives that you are affecting. And I think Thebe is so correct that, the kind of discombobulation that would be happening with Chidimma now, having grown up in South Africa, having been born in South Africa, having believed that she's South African, and in fact, wanting to represent South Africa on the national and ultimately the international stage, because Miss South Africa gets to represent the country on an international stage, and then to be treated the way that she has been treated at the level of a government official, a minister of sports, arts and culture, who ought to be one of the biggest supporters of these kinds of sports, arts and culture type of initiatives, must be very devastating for her, but it must also be devastating for her more than anything. The fact that, I think even the response by Fikile Mbalula to say that the Minister of Home Affairs must go into the archive or give some kind of clarity on this is really just a serious invasion of the privacy of Chidimma. It's a serious invasion on the dignity, assault on her dignity, that she should be in a position where she, the Department of Home Affairs goes and comes to South Africa to prove to South Africa. Miss South Africa would have done this due diligence to take on the contestants that enter the competition. So certainly if she's in this competition, then she has met the test of credibility and the test of her citizenship. And so for this to now become a national discourse and conversation that must include her private confidential records being put in front of the country to prove the humanness is actually no different to the situation that we witnessed in the United States when former President Barack Obama had to prove his own citizenship, his own Americanness in the face of the assaults that he was at the time getting from the Republican candidate at the time, Donald Trump. And I do think that, as Thebe has correctly said, we must at all times, as analysts, as writers, as scholars and all of that, when we are talking about this situation, remember that we are talking about a human being here. And I do think, just to answer your question, Toli, that she certainly is a South African. There are various ways, according to the Citizenship Act in South Africa, there are various ways in which one can acquire South African citizenship. And I think it's important, Toli, to speak on the two broad groups of people who are eligible to apply for South African citizenship by naturalization, right? These include two categories, Toli. It's a child who's born in South Africa, who parents who are not South African or who do not possess a permanent residence in the country, and that child can apply for South African citizenship when they turn the age of 18, provided that he or she has lived in South Africa from the date of his or her birth until the date of turning 18, as well as provided that his or her birth has been registered in accordance with the provisions of the Births and Registration Act with the Department of Home Affairs. And the second way in which someone can get citizenship by naturalization is if that person is in possession of a permanent residence, right? And they have ordinarily resided in South Africa for at least 5 years after acquiring that permanent residence status, and who has not been absent in South Africa for a period of more than 90 days in any year in which they would have been in South Africa for that 5 years. So you can get a citizenship by naturalization having been born in South Africa to non-resident parent, or you can even apply for the citizenship by naturalization when you are an adult, you are older, and you would have lived in South Africa for 5 years after having obtained your citizenship, having obtained your permanent residence. So for me, it's neither here nor there which category of naturalization Chidimma would have acquired. But the fact that she was born in South Africa clearly indicates she qualifies for the first category of a child born to non-resident parent who would have been who turns 18 and has lived in South Africa, has been born, and their birth has been registered. Or even if Chidimma applied for this citizenship after the age of 8, as an adult, after she would have stayed in South Africa for 5 years. That is what the law prescribes. That is what the South African citizenship prescribes. It does not say that you are South African only if you are born to South Africa and to South African parents. And I think the problem with Gayton McKenzie is that complete disregard for the law.
She finishes her thought process by prompting the name of the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture, Gayton McKenzie. I just want to quote directly what he said this week. And I quote now, "We truly cannot have Nigerians compete in our Miss South Africa competition. I want to get all facts before I comment, but it gives funny vibes already." This is what he said on the platform X. What is the minister getting at here?
But he's probably correct on two things. He's correct that you cannot have a non-South African compete in a South African competition of this nature if you are not legally South African. Assuming when he says a Nigerian, he means a non-documented or a non-legal South African, if you will. So that's how I'm looking at it. And he's correct in the one other part when he says he needs to get information. I guess perhaps what he shouldn't have done, he shouldn't have added a little bit extra at the end on saying it gives a funny vibes. But we know Gayton is quite a off-the-cuff minister, and I'm hoping that he didn't mean it in that way.
But doesn't that place him in an awkward position?
Yeah.
Because he now speaks as a government authority, no longer as leader of the Patriotic Alliance, which, by the way, is associated with hating or anti-immigrant. So,
but having said that as well, he's not the Minister of Home Affairs.
Right.
And perhaps that's why he says he needs to look into it. But I don't think he is the person who's authorized to speak on that space. And in the same way that Mbalula is saying now that they need to look into it. But of course, the assumption is we all should know the laws of the country, if you're a minister or if you're a party leader, because it's Citizenship Act of 95. It's pretty simple and it's pretty clear, as Malaika has put it forward now.
Should he not have investigated first before
he should have
making comments?
A person in that position should always first have the facts before they comment. I mean, it's standard practice, of course. He's a new minister. He's a non-politician. I mean, he's a new politician, a new government minister. So perhaps one would give him the slack and say because he's new. But under normal circumstances, he should not make that statement until he's got the facts on hand.
Malaika, I don't want us to go around in circles here because people might think we're speaking in codes. Let's be clear in the language we use. What Chidimma has experienced in the last couple of days, weeks, is it xenophobia? Straight and simple.
It is absolutely. In fact, Koli, I dare say it's not xenophobia. I don't think there is actually a lot of xenophobia that happens in South Africa. I think there's a lot of Afrophobia. Afrophobia speaks to a specific intolerance for people of African descent and for persons of color. Xenophobia is speaking about general intolerance in broad terms. And I think I agree with the EFF. A few days ago, the EFF released a statement. And in that statement, the economic freedom fighters made reference to a number of examples in which people who are born of white people, born of parents with European ancestry, have never been placed under the level of scrutiny that Chidimma would have been placed under. And the EFF in their statement uses the example of Natasha Mazzoni, a member of parliament who was a chief whip of the DA at some point in parliament, very, very prominent position, a very prominent woman, a very well-known woman. And in all the disagreements that South Africans have had with Natasha Mazzoni, for example, we would have raised issues about her falsification of qualifications. We would have even raised issues about our disagreement with the politics of the DA. Never at any point has the issue of the nationality of Natasha Mazzoni been brought into question. And in fact, if we want to say that this is happening only because Chidimma is in the artistic space, we do know that would not be true, because quite a number of Black South African politicians have also been subjected to the kind of attacks that Chidimma is subjected to. We will remember with the late mayor of Johannesburg, what is his name? Sorry, I forgot. I'm forgetting the name. The late mayor of Johannesburg who died in a car accident, Chidimma Adetshina, was subjected to the same type of attacks. Malusi Gigaba at some point was subjected to the same levels of attack, which were at the time started by the late Vechimento and so on. There's been a number of Black prominent people who have had to explain themselves, who have had to answer to the question of their citizenship. EFF member of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature, Naledi Chirwa, is often a subject of these kinds of attacks, right? A South African-born woman, very South African in every sense of the word, is often subjected to these kinds of attacks. You don't hear this about white South Africans who are actually born of foreign parents. You don't hear of this happening. And I do think that totally says to me, we are not just dealing with an intolerance of foreign nationals in inverted commas. We are dealing with an intentional disregard and dehumanization of specifically Black people that we do not deem as South Africans. So we must call it by its proper name. It's Afrophobic violence.
Absolutely. I mean, she's absolutely correct in her statement. But we have to say, though, that where we are actually in this point with the Chidimma issue, it's definitely Afrophobia. I absolutely agree with that. But I think it's actually raising a very important issue in South Africa now, which is what does it actually mean to be South African? Because I think the biggest challenge that South Africa has had in the 30 years since we found our freedom is actually articulating what it means to be South African. Because if you look at the comments in the social media. So it is perhaps a mix of citizenship, which is Afrophobia in one part, and then on the other part, it's actually an issue about identity. Because people are saying we cannot have somebody who doesn't speak our language, doesn't embrace our culture, doesn't tell our story, represent us. I'm not sure how correct they are with that. I'm not sure what level of detail or information they have on her if she doesn't embody all those, but it does bring to fore the biggest issue that we face as a country. Because I don't know what it means to be South African. Does it mean that just because I speak 11 languages or 12 languages now that I'm South African? Surely the biggest thing that they're bringing up now as a country is a time for South Africa to actually define what does it mean to be South Africa. And if you are going to represent me as a South African, what are you taking with that means South Africans?
Have we had a conversation? I mean, I know the former president, Thabo Mbeki, prompted this, and the president now has made it a national agenda item for us to have this national dialogue, to talk about, I guess, all issues that trouble South Africans. But do you think we have had a proper conversation if we look back to the xenophobic attacks that date as far back as, I think it was 2008, if I'm not correct.
2008 and 2013, and the sporadic, of course, yes.
Indeed. Have we had thoroughgoing conversations about it?
No, we have not. No, we have
Why
not.
do we...
No.
Why do we behave in that manner?
If we'd had those conversations, we'd have had a solution and an answer for these challenges. Remember, South Africa has gone through a couple of phases. The first phase was the fight for freedom, or the fight to get into South Africa. The next phase now is a fight to participate in the economy of South Africa. But the biggest fight that South Africa has yet to have is this fight of defining what it means to be South African. Because once you define that, you'll be able to understand how to articulate some of these issues. But of course, the other bigger issue for South Africa, other than the identity issue, is the fact, and along the Afrophobia line of thinking, is the fact that South Africans, in the absence or in their frustrations with dealing with issues of unemployment, poverty, inequality, and their inability to be able to challenge a government on those are now taking it out on other Africans who've come to the country and who unfortunately have not looked to the government to try and solve their problems, but they've said, how can I be resourceful and create a way of living for me? Now, if you look at South Africa, what 30 or 40% of South Africa is on the dole, is on SASSA, if you will. So it means we're a very dependent country. So we've created a nanny state of some sort. And as a nanny state of some sort, we are looking too much to the government to solve our problems. Yeah. And whereas some of these foreign nationals come to South Africa, they create a better life. And now we look at them and they're doing much better than we should be doing. And now, because they look like us and they're doing better than us, now we are taking out our frustrations on them. And we say that they are coming to take from us. They should leave our country. That's the challenge that we're facing if you really look the truth in the eyes.
Yeah. Well, there is this competition of resources, Malaika, and I seem to recall that South Africa at times does get into an unhealthy competition, if you like, particularly with Nigeria. Sometimes Nigeria is seen as overtaking South Africa in terms of economic performance, and other times you will hear that South Africa has regained that position. Do you think there is an unhealthy competition just from a government-to-government perspective between South Africa and specifically Nigeria, or are we too simplistic?
No, look, I think it's very important that, particularly in discussions around xenophobia and Afrophobia, that we actually move away from the isolationism that we tend to employ when we look at politics that happen in South Africa. As it was said in my introduction, I'm speaking to you now from Germany, right? And it's very interesting because the same problems that are being experienced in South Africa today in relation to how we associate the anti-immigrant sentiment or how we look at other Africans or even other South Africans for that matter. And I say other South Africans because you will remember actually that in 2008, of the, I think it was about 91 or 61 South African or people who were killed in that particular xenophobic violence. About 32 of them actually turned out to be South African, right? And large majority of them Tsonga speaking and Venda speaking South Africans. But, and maybe that's probably one of the other things we'll get into about the dangers of Afrophobia, is how it actually extends beyond just our intolerance and our hatred for other people outside of Africa, outside of South Africa, and extends to even ethnic competition, ethnic intolerances that are intra in the country. But I do think that we need to understand the issue of the anti-immigrant sentiment in South Africa in the context of the entirety of the world, because this is a very global issue. It is not a South African issue alone. It is a very global issue. I'll give you an example. Here in Germany, where I am right now, one of the biggest challenges that is currently facing the German government, and in fact the European Union, as it were, is the rise of very right-wing nationalist organizations and parties, which are now, in fact, one of the biggest parties in the European Parliament. But in Germany here, for example, now the third biggest political party in Germany is one called the Alternative for Deutschland, which is AfD, right? And this is a very anti-immigrant, very right-wing political party that's saying, we want foreigners out of Germany and so on. But this is not just a German question as well. It is happening everywhere across the European Union. It is happening everywhere across Europe. It was, in fact, one of at the heart of this thing, at the heart of Brexit in the United Kingdom. One of the things that, for example, when you engage with British literature now, part of the things about which they judged the previous administration under Rishi Sunak was that, you did not send back enough boats. And by boats, when he kept saying we'll send back the boats, he was referring to the boats that travel from France through the English Channel, which often would be carrying immigrants. And you read everywhere else in the world. In fact, in the United States right now, the issue about Kamala Harris, her identity, her origins and all of that, this is a very real global phenomenon. And it's very curious that you speak about how this often becomes a competition for resources. And that's true. A lot of anti-immigrant sentiments often tends to find expression when there is an economic decline. Yeah. A week ago in Germany, it was reported that the German economy has contracted and that unemployment in Germany has actually increased. And so as you see this kind of contest for economic resources, you also begin to see a rise in an anti-immigrant sentiment, because then immigrants are seen as people who are taking the jobs away from us. And often it is not spoken exactly what kind of jobs are being referred to, because even in South Africa, Thebe was speaking about how immigrants in South Africa tend to be very divorced from, even receiving support from the state and so on, that they tend to be people who do things on their own. And I do think that there is legitimate basis to argue that when you are sitting at home, you are at home in Diepsloot or Soweto, where I come from and so on, and you are standing outside in the morning, you are unemployed, you are a young South African, you wake up every morning, you stand by the gate and just watch people walking past, and you see, someone who is a Mozambican or someone who is known to be a Zimbabwean walking on their way to work and so on, right? At that moment, your thinking is that they are going to work. It does not matter that they are going to be working where they're exploited. It does not matter that they've got a precarious job or anything. For you, when you look at that person, you begin to see a sense of privilege that you don't have. And I think what that kind of a thing, that in that way, we can't delegitimize, for example, the feeling of South Africans that they're excluded from the economic system. I do think it's a legitimate concern that South Africans do raise, but I think that in terms of how they analyze the roots of this thing, that is where it becomes problematic, because to many of them, the roots becomes, it's foreign nationals, they're here, they're taking over, as opposed to looking at a system of racialized capitalism and neoliberalism that exists precisely on the back of creating that kind of inequality and using migrant labor in particular for exploitation in ways that it would not be able to do because the laws of South Africa would not allow. I don't think South Africans have an appreciation of just how much foreign nationals and particularly low-skilled and semi-skilled immigrants are highly exploited in the South African industry and in the private sector specifically. Yeah. There's so much exploitation that happens there. And at that level, you could have a room or a space for some kind of allyship that would happen. Yeah. But because of a lack of theorization of why these inequalities are happening and what is the root cause of these inequalities, it becomes then easier to target the spaza shop owner, to target a person who you are in close proximity to, as opposed to arguing and confronting the bigger system that is there in the JSE, that is there happening far away from the reality. And that is where the issue is. That is where these things are happening. And that is why the conversation must extend beyond our own immediate discontent with the immigrant who's selling their labor as our domestic worker, or who's selling fruit on the streets, to going into the bigger questions about the very structural construct of the South African economy that is exclusionary to all Black people, regardless of their status in South Africa, because Black people who are South Africans also experience the same levels of exploitation and exclusion that immigrants experience 10 times even more.
Let's close it on this point, Thebe. Because Malaika, yes, she's said quite a mouthful, but there are elements that I'm picking up where she connects this to our apartheid past. Do you think that as Black people in South Africa, we are struggling to shake off that apartheid mentality, which in some parts of the country did prompt what is known as black-on-black violence, the tribalist behavior? Do you think that we have never been able to shake that off?
Of course, it's impossible that in one generation we'll be able to shake off the long-term effects of apartheid. So there's no question that that is one of the biggest or the long-standing problems that we have in the country. But I wanted to say one more other thing about South Africa, talking about apartheid and all those, or our past as well, is that one of the bigger challenges that if you look at from an outside in, looking into South Africa, is looking at South Africa as a very unwelcoming country. And people look at South Africa and say that, but this country forget that what did Tanzania do for them? What did did Zambia do for them? What did Nigeria do for them during apartheid? So there's also a view that South Africa, now that it's seen or it's found its freedom, is a bit now practicing apartheid, if you will, of its own fellow Africans. And you know, one of the senior party leaders gave me a call this week about the same subject, and he said to me, Thebe, you know, the biggest problem that mistake that we've made when we came into government is our failure to help South Africans broadly understand our relationship with the rest of the continent. Understand not necessarily that we should be forever grateful, but we need to understand how do we incorporate all this. So some of the other bigger challenge with South Africa is actually a criminal issue, because from a criminal issue is that because you now have these because these very porous borders, they've got an influx of people from everywhere. Now that is not the problem of the foreigners. That is a problem of the government of South Africa. Its inability to apply the laws that it has on the books. So South Africa needs to do a better job as a country. We need to do a better job of applying the law, and also as South Africans, we also need to avoid taking, and we talked about Nigeria earlier, that of course South Africa's got a challenge with Nigerians because it's a bigger country, 300 million people or 250 million people. And so of course they stand out more than anybody else. And then in South Africa, the bigger challenge is if one or two criminal elements happen to be Nigerian, now we're casting aspersions on the rest of the country, the rest of Nigeria as a criminal country, as Nigeria as unwelcoming. I think our biggest problem as South Africa is, of course, it's a combination of things. Malaika said it already. It's one is the long-term effects of apartheid. You can't just shake off 400 years of apartheid. Of apartheid and being oppressed, and then be expected in 30 years to be able to come to the front. But we cannot use that as an excuse either, because in 30 years we should have done something better to at least advance that. There's many examples around the world. In 1994, Rwanda was completely decimated because of tribal fights. 1 million people destroyed are killed in 30 days, in 3 months. Sorry. But where the country is a much better country now from as a law-abiding country, as a country with a clear vision. What we lack in South Africa is loss. We lack a clear vision of who we want to be as a country, and defining and articulating what it means to be South African. Because if you know where we want to be as a country, and you know what it means to be South African, so you know what you're fighting for. You know what is worth fighting for. Instead of thinking as we do in South Africa, that our thinking is every 5 years of elections, instead of every 500 years as the Chinese do.
Well, part of it is learning our history, as you said. And I don't know whether as South Africans we appreciate the amount that has been done for us in this country, our leaders in this country, when they sought refuge in those foreign lands. All right, I want to thank you very much for your reflections today. Thebe Ikalafeng, he is a Brand Africa founder and chairperson. Malaika Mahlatsi joining us from Germany, a social commentator. Thank you very much for weighing in and reflecting, helping us to reflect on what has happened. And yeah, that's where we are going to leave the conversation this week. We'll give you more news after this.